Okay, so I just want to give a talk on what's been happening in the Middle East over the past 2 days or so. I'm sure most of you have heard that there was an attack in Tunisia at a tourist resort in Sousse, along a beach, where I'm not sure the exact figure, but about 20 people, maybe more, were killed by extremists, what the media would call jihadis, whatever. And also there was another attack in Kuwait yesterday at a Shia mosque, which is something that's quite atypical of considering that Kuwait is actually quite a stable country. But I want to explain the kind of patterns behind this and the roots and motivations for the people who are carrying out these atrocities. And I think it's about time that somebody said something about it. At least I have to do so for my own conscience, because I think especially for a Western audience, there's sensationalism on the first hand. There's just flat out lack of comprehension, and unfortunately, most people aren't really interested in really understanding what's actually happening, and what exactly is the root or the cause of this extremist violence, these massacres that we're seeing quite regularly. And we barely see half the massacres that happen in places like Syria and Iraq, and the place that's just generally referred to as the Middle East, which is a way to kind of, it plays with people's minds if there's a place that's just kind of defamiliarized and just called the Middle East or Africa. Whereas, anytime the media is going to reference, at least the English language media is going to reference Europe, it doesn't talk about Europe in general terms. It'll talk about Sweden, or it might talk about Stockholm more specifically, or Paris. It'll talk about Paris, but won't talk about France, or it won't call it Western Europe, but or Europe. They don't kind of generalize it as this sort of vague landmass inhabited by vague groups of people. Homogenous groups of people is what's implied, is that they're all kind of the same. It's just the Middle East, that's just the people there. The Middle East is far more diverse than even Europe, far more diverse. So that's one thing. Now, most people know that all these attacks are being done in the name of Islam, Islamic terrorism, etc., etc. And I think there's two problems here. There are problems with how the Western media is portraying this and simplifying it. And there are problems within the Muslim community and how Muslims are addressing the issue. You have Muslims in the wider Muslim world who are more concerned with making ends meet, just dealing with the kind of day-to-day realities. And this is, of course, most people know, the month of Ramadan as well. So it's also, in a way, it should be more shocking that there are these violent atrocities happening actually right now in Muslim countries. And I think it's something that is being kind of normalized to a degree actually now. The shock is kind of being taken out of the fact that 23 people are being murdered in cold blood, worshippers at that in the case of Kuwait. And I think it's shocking and it's disgusting equally what happened in Tunisia and Kuwait. And we're going to hear more about it over the coming days, no doubt about it. But we're not going to hear about it in reference to what happened, let's say a year ago, let's say 10 years ago, let alone about 700 or 800 years ago, which is a period that I'm going to actually talk about. Because in a way, something happened about 700 years ago, 750 years ago, that certainly most non-Muslims, unless you were a scholar of religion or something like that, would be aware of, and let alone Muslims themselves, because there is an important historical root for the ideas that have developed, or at least the justifications for the violence that's taking place, that Muslims, now we have to be honest and say that these people that are born and raised as Muslims, what they're doing, does it represent Islam? No, not in the slightest. It doesn't represent any religion. It doesn't represent religious thought, religious life, religious morality. It represents fanaticism. It is a product of poverty and ignorance, and also a much wider geopolitical strategy. So the people who carry out all these acts, overwhelmingly, and there are statistics about this. You can research it, especially if Arabic is your first language or you're fluent in Arabic, and you can kind of learn more or dig around and find the kind of statistics about the types of people and where they're from that are committing these kind of acts. About ISIS, I'm talking about, and other related extremist groups who use violence as their methods. And so, without straying too far from the point, there's a man called Ibn Taymiyyah, and he was a Muslim theologian and scholar in the 13th century. He's Syrian. And the context that he arose out of was what in Arabic is more referred to as the Mongol Holocaust. And it was a Holocaust, the Mongol invasions, when the Mongols sacked large parts of the Muslim world. Baghdad, it was quite a notable kind of event. It's historically quite significant what happened in Baghdad, at least, because a huge amount of the population were killed by Mongol invaders. So Ibn Taymiyyah was living in a period of historical turbulence. And now you have to understand that Islam was established for about 600 years at this point, and the Muslim world, there was the Umayyad Caliphate, and after that had a particular kind of reach geographically, and then there was also the Abbasid Caliphate. And when the Mongols came along, they caused a lot of chaos because it laid the seeds for a lot of future kind of dynasties, particularly the kind of Turkic Muslim dynasties that came out in that general area in the Muslim world at the time. And Ibn Taymiyyah was forced to flee his home in Damascus when these Mongol invaders were wreaking havoc across the Muslim world. And in his mind, and I'm not in any way justifying anything that he propounded, his views, his ideas, his ideology, not at all. But at the same time, you have to be able to understand why they thought that way, why they espoused the views that they had, why they wrote certain things and formulated certain doctrines. And in the case of Ibn Taymiyyah, you had a man here whose worldview was turned upside down, because up until that point, Islam, at least in the Muslim world, there was a view of Islam. It was understood as a success because of its military success. It was understood as being successful because it had won so many battles. It had made so much. It had made such a conquest. Some of it peacefully, some of it very forcefully. And the perception was among a lot of Muslim philosophers at the time, up until that point, that the Muslim world was granted these victories. Islam was proved to be the right religion by the fact that it had expanded so much. And for Ibn Taymiyyah and people in the Muslim world then to witness this almost annihilation of, let's say, the Abbasid Caliphate, which was the seat of Islam at the time. The Abbasid Caliphate was located in Baghdad, and it had quite a far reach, the Abbasid Caliphate. And it was the center of Islamic learning and things like that. And you had there's a famous saying about how the Tigris and the Euphrates in Baghdad, they ran not just with blood but with ink, because the Mongols had destroyed libraries and just burned things down, just indiscriminately, massive kind of terror and violence. And this kind of inspired such kind of fear in the minds of the Muslims, that scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah began to emerge with this very, very reactionary theology, because they believed that the source of all this chaos and all this terror was retribution from God, because the Muslims, the Ummah, had gone astray. There were deviant ideas. They weren't practicing Orthodox Islam. They were deviating from the true way or the original Islam. That's the thinking. We have to get into the mindset of someone like Ibn Taymiyyah. And it's very hard for people these days to kind of have that kind of religious understanding or empathize with that. and this is more than just a religious understanding, it's a complete kind of worldview, in that everything is kind of rooted in every action that you do, and your fate as an individual is going to be determined by God. So that translates over into the Muslim community as a whole, the Muslim world as a whole. So if you're successful, God is pleased with you. If you're unsuccessful and you happen to be invaded by a horde of barbarians, then surely God is displeased with you. And that was Ibn Taymiyyah's kind of, that's how he rationalized it. So for him, it was the actions of the Muslims that were to blame. There was something wrong with the direction that Islam was taken in. It was the practice of the Muslims that had brought this about. They were the ones that almost deserved to be punished by God, and they were being punished by God for not following Islam correctly. That was his kind of rationality. And you see a very kind of analogous situation with Christian theologians and philosophers in the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages. For example, if you look at the writings and the reactions to the Black Death, the plague, it was largely seen as a scourge upon mankind by God, because surely mankind had done something wrong. The fault is with the people, So that leads the most fervent people in religion to become very, very reactionary and focus all their efforts on what they think, of course, and the road to hell is paved with good intentions. They thought that if they could somehow get people back to what they understood to be orthodoxy or the right religious practice and understanding, then God would be pleased with them. It's a very simplistic kind of worldview, but we have to be able to understand and comprehend why these people understood the world that way, why they preached the doctrines that they preached. So in the case of Ibn Taymiyyah, it's a very reactionary theology. Getting into what it actually is, for him, there was a very, very small group of people who are actually real Muslims, and he began a practice which in Arabic is known as takfir. And takfir basically means accusing, arbitrarily just accusing people of unbelief or blasphemy on very spurious grounds. If you suspect someone isn't following the orthodoxy, then you can call them an infidel, an unbeliever, etc., etc. Even though these people that may be being accused are faithful people who do good deeds, or they could be the nicest people in the world, but they mightn't be doing or following the way that these fervent theologians or reformers, or really they're innovators, espouse. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, if you were of the Shia tradition, if you had a Sufi practice of the religion, or if you belonged to a particular school of thought that he thought deviated from the orthodoxy, you were an unbeliever. So he would practice takfir and say, not Muslim, etc., etc. And Ibn Taymiyyah is on the historical record of attacking Christians physically for not believing in Islam. and attacking and persecuting Sufis and Shias to the extreme. So it was this kind of it's this kind of rationality and logic which is actually, this is the historical root of the modern Islamic fundamentalism and the fanaticism that's been developing increasingly. There are other factors at play, of course, as I say. There are geopolitical factors, economic factors. How else do extremists kind of emerge? There needs to be a context of hopelessness and despair. That's the only reason young men get kind of dragged into this extremism in the first place. And if you look at where these extremists are coming from, they're very, very poor contexts. They're very, very poor social conditions. So there's a lack of education on those who are used by the manipulators and the people who are hiring, if you like, the useful idiots for these extremist groups. Because the people who are actually running these extremist groups are often educated people from the Gulf of Arabia, from Saudi Arabia, from Qatar, from the UAE, etc., etc. So the brains behind it, they know what they're doing. They're manipulators, and they know how they can take advantage of the ignorance and poverty of young men in places like Tunisia, Morocco, and Palestine, and other parts of the Muslim world. And often a context where there is already like a political instability or fragility, so it's easier to kind of play on the kind of political aspirations or hopes of young men in their context and use them for your own ends. So Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and there's a pattern with a lot of these self-proclaimed caliphs or leaders in these terrorist organizations, and that's what they are. Takhrib, it is terrorism, what they're doing. Not in the vague, generalized sense that the Western media would have it, and they apply that term and that logic to specific ethnic groups when it serves wider Western geopolitical interests. Yeah, of course, because if you're white and you go out and kill somebody, if you're Anders Breivik, in Norway, you're not so much a terrorist. You're just or what happened in America recently in the church shooting. You're not a terrorist. It's not terrorism. Because if that label was applied and things, spade was called a spade, then people would be associating what they had previously associated with a given religion or given ethnic group to themselves. And that can't be done because it's counterintuitive. It goes against the wider interests of people like the neoconservatives in America, or that seemingly eternal political class of imperialists, neo-imperialists in Britain. And Europe still has imperialism very much. It has a very strong imperialist tradition. It's just done by proxy today. And you can look at somewhere like Africa, and it's living proof of that, let alone the Middle East. And we know the wider interests that are at play. And you can see that I am not at all professional how I'm structuring my talk here. But my point is that there is a historical root for what's happening, for these violent atrocities, and we shouldn't see them or evaluate them on a case-by-case basis, because in our minds we are isolating the incidents. It's like in medicine. If you want to make a diagnosis, you have to have the case history of the patient and things. You can't just look at one symptom. You look at you look at it holistically. You see the broader picture, and that's what has to be done. And it's just something that I try to. When I can, I'm no expert in anything. I might know a little bit about religion or its history and things like that because I read, and it's something I'm genuinely interested in. And I follow politics and what happens in Iraq and Syria, for example, when I can, because to me it's important. And it's very important, especially how the Muslims, being a Muslim myself, being able to kind of it's more urgent, in a sense, to identify the problem here. And if I'm to continue with medical analogies, it's that there is a kind of cancer in Islam, or certainly a cancer among the Muslims. The religion of Islam is the religion of Islam. We all bring our own interpretations to that, and there are very, very old traditions, well established traditions in Islam, philosophical traditions, etc., that have developed over 1,400 years of the religion's history. But what's happening in Islam over the past 200 years, really, with the birth of the modern era, a lot of it coincides with the American Revolution, the French Revolution. A lot of new ideas began to emerge, and the Industrial Revolution is a part of it as well. But there was a huge amount of, I'm not sure if reform is the word, a lot of movements developed within the Muslim world around the 19th and 18th centuries. And Muhammed ibn Abdul Wahab in Saudi Arabia, who was a charismatic theologian from the backwaters of Saudi Arabia, which before it was even called Saudi Arabia, in a region known as Najd. He had a marriage of convenience with a powerful tribe called the House of Saud at the time, and this is what gave rise to the modern Saudi state, because Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, like Ibn Taymiyyah, he continued on with his kind of tradition of and practice of takfir. And here's the key, especially for the Muslims I'm talking to, it's takfir. It's assuming that you have the right, and just without even any moral consideration to your own kind of faith, or how God would judge you in the Day of Judgment, to just, without a second thought, apply the label of unbeliever, or cry blasphemy when it suits you, to not just one individual, but we're talking over 250 million people. Because the Muslim population is about 1.4 billion, at least 1.3 billion. And about 250 million of those Muslims, we're talking about 12 to 15%, are either Shia, Ibadi, or something that's developed, as I say, a part of the reform movements of the past 100, 200 years. They're Quranists. So there are different traditions in Islam: Sunni, Shia, Ibadi, Quranists now. And then you have another, really, that hides behind the guise of Sunni Islam, and that's Salafism or Wahhabism. Wahhabism, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab from Najd in Saudi Arabia, 1798, he published his Theology, which, if I remember the Arabic, roughly is Ahl al-Salafiyya, as-Salihin, as-Salafin, as-Salihin, the original pious companions, basically, the way of the original pious companions. And that's a rough kind of translation, because it's hard to get it exactly, but his idea, the original Muslims, the best Muslims, the companions of Prophet Muhammad, and the generation after that are the ideal, and they embody true Islam. And that was his idea, or his approach, to justify his doctrine of takfir. And he, with an army, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab, at the end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, with thousands of troops of the House of Saud, this political dynasty that was emerging, went to Karbala in Iraq, where millions of Shia pilgrims go every year, and in cold blood killed 2,000 people. And this is something that most Muslims don't historically know. But it's there if you want to do your own reading, if you want to actually look at the history. There are hundreds of books you can go to, even in English, about the origins of Wahhabism. So there are these movements in the kind of 18th, 19th century that emerged, these political movements, also in places like India. in Pakistan that in a way, on the one hand, are reactions to increasing encroachment of European imperialism in the region and the decaying Ottoman Empire. So the idea of the Muslim Caliphate is completely on the wane, it's crumbling. And so you have insecure, middle-aged Muslim men with their own prejudices and their own worldview, espousing their vision of Islam, which is becoming very popular, quite clearly, among people like ISIS. And just like Ibn Taymiyyah as well, there's a pattern in how these ideologies and why they're developing. They're developing to reactions of outside encroachment politically. So you had the Mongols in the 13th century for Ibn Taymiyyah, and for Muhammed ibn Abdul Wahab, and some of the other movements in the Muslim world in India and Pakistan, the Deobandi movement, also very influential today. These are reactions to wider political structures outside their context. So you have to be able to look at it in the light of history, in the light of religion, and you have to be able to fundamentally just, even if you hate them with all your guts, and I hate people who use religion for their own agenda. They justify violence in the name of religion. I hate those people. But at the same time, I have to use my empathy to be able to understand why do they think like that? What are their aims and objectives? And just realize you pity them at the end of the day. You pity them. So the pattern of atrocities and killings that have happened over the past few days will unfortunately continue. But if people can be aware just of the history, and even if whether you're religious or not, to kind of understand the fundamentalism that's at play here. It's a very, very intolerant, literalist, simplistic understanding of things that belie the age-old traditions that have developed within all the world religions. And knowing these realities is important. It really helps you kind of understand, not justify what's happening, but you understand. You really begin to understand that it begins to make sense. So I will stop there, and that's that. I just had to say my piece.